Today we would be talking about the Napoleonic Reforms. The lectures are split into two parts. This is going to be the first discussion related to Napoleonic Reforms, so it's titled as Napoleonic Reforms 1. We have earlier spoken about various facets of the French Revolution, ranging from its background, the intellectual climate, causes, its various phases spread over the three distinct stages, stage 1, 2 and 3. And thereafter, in the earlier lecture, I had spoken to you about the rise of Napoleon, which is attributed to the third phase of the revolution. To be more precise, but obviously Napoleon was part of the French army and he had many victories to his credit, even in the period prior to the Directory period, that is from say 1795 onwards. So even during the reign of terror, that is the second phase of the revolution, he was arrested as a terrorist on the charge of being a terrorist, and that had earned him a lot of popularity, fame, and also faith of the Frenchmen, because he had taken on even the English might and tried to assert the supremacy of France, a newly created Republican France. So all that we have earlier spoken of, and we had come up to 1899 when he becomes the leader of France, first consul, and that's how the journey, the Napoleonic period begins, and it continues up to 1814, 1815, around the time when he was finally defeated, and we have the Congress of Vienna that was signed, and that swung the political map of Europe back to pre-1789 days. This arrangement also couldn't quite last long, but France had to relapse into several such phases of monarchy, so much so that France had to declare itself republic thrice, say till around 1870 or so, and thereafter it stabilized as a republic. Now, that's the big picture around Napoleon, and we are situating Napoleon within this context. And let's begin talking about the developments from 1899 onwards, and we will see that eventually Napoleon embarks on the project of creating an empire of France, and that happened little later. But before that, there were several elements of the revolutionary sensibilities that he shouldered and carried forward. So Napoleonic phase is debated amongst historians in terms of whether Napoleon was a child of the revolution or he breached the boundaries of the revolutionary France and did quite a few things that were distinctly his own. He comes across to us as a pragmatist ruler who did not see himself bound in terms of strategies and efforts to rule over France. There are moments, and we shall be talking about, where he is seen as compromising with the principles of the revolution or acting in contravention to the spirit and principles of the French Revolution. Yet, one thing that goes on to prove all through his period, Napoleonic period, is that he was a good strategist and also a pragmatist. So there are quite a few things that he did just to consolidate his position, but at the same time there is an overriding evidence of quite a few things that were very central to the revolutionary sensibilities, like rule of law and careers being thrown open to merit, and several others that he propagated not only as policy measures for ruling over France, but even beyond, when he embarked upon the project of creating an empire. The areas outside France that he came to influence or directly take under the French rule, those were the areas where these principles, these progressive principles, were introduced. And some of these areas, like say Central Europe, the German Confederacy area, or the Confederacy of Rhine, as it was called, they had yielded good results. There were sections of people who were excited by these principles of the revolution. They had seen it happening, unfolding in their areas for the first time. It galvanized the forces that could take on the monarchical order in their areas and clamor for rule of law, clamor for some representative politics or governance or republicanism. Some of them succeeded momentarily, quite a few of them failed, but they had created for the first time in these areas some kind of a social base for these political ideals to be taken up later. So there are quite a few positives related to Napoleonic Empire and his reforms and so forth, and it need not only be seen therefore within the boundary of France, right? So let's try and understand each of them in particular or in separate heads. For example, centralization and finance. In the domain of political centralization and finance, what we find is that the period from 1799 to 1804, when he declares himself as the emperor, these are the times when, as a first consul, Napoleon emerged effectively as a dictator. So there were institutions, representative institutions, there was a constitution and so forth, but in effect, by now, ever since 1789, France or French politics had known enough how to circumvent these structures, newly created structures, to actually govern with a firm hand. It had been experimented with during the Reign of Terror by the committees. Even the Directory period is associated with having undone the popular mandate in the first free and fair elections in 1797, and we have spoken about it. So that was nothing new for France. Nevertheless, Napoleon emerges effectively as a dictator during this period, 1799 to 1804, despite technically being only the first consul. As I told you that France had been given yet another constitution which had guaranteed, at least in writing, universal male suffrage, but effectively, as I told you, through various means and ways, it is the entrepreneurs and the professionals who were in the saddle of power through indirect elections, right? So that tells you about the social profile of the ruling class, the access that a particular section of society actually had over the levers of political power. Napoleon also organized, and this was just for the optics of it, a plebiscite to approve the new constitution. He had ordered a new constitution. The convention had given to France yet another second constitution, And in this plebiscite, as you can see on your slide, the votes in favor of the new constitution, which in effect was a ratification of the rule of Napoleon. You have overwhelming majority voting for the constitution, right? So it is claimed that it was not a very fair kind of plebiscite. It was already loaded in favor of the ruler, Napoleon. Yet it at least demonstrated, it at least created some kind of an optics or some kind of a pretense of him being in a position which was popularly mandated, right? So this plebiscite in effect served as almost an election for him. There was a provision for a legislative body in the new constitution, but as I said in the beginning, it could neither initiate nor discuss legislation. In effect, it was all coming from Napoleon. The deliberations and even the legislative part of it actually depended on the will and intent of one person, Napoleon. That's why I am saying that from this period, 1801 to 1804, Napoleon emerges as the dictator in France. So what does he do? Despite the presence of a legislative body, how does he make governance subservient to him? Is by making use of a council of state to draft laws. And again, as was very evident, in reality, it was the authority of one man which was all that mattered, and the council of state was just a kind of pretense, a kind of formal structure through which these drafting of laws were actually carried out. Yet, and this is important, Bonaparte had little desire to undo the major egalitarian reforms of the revolution. That's important because we have already said that he had emerged as a dictator, and he could have done whatever he wanted that way. But it goes to his credit that his personal make was also in sync with the ethos of the French Revolution. So entire major egalitarian reforms that had been undertaken in different courses of the revolution, those were not undone. For example, the kind of legislations, the feudal privileges having been done away with, monopolies having been done away with, trade unionism having been done away with, guild system having been done away with. All these things were major kind of inroads into modernity, and it had given a death blow to the ancient regime. And despite being a dictator, Bonaparte does not go back. Despite betraying quite a few imperial and monarchical tendencies, as we will see subsequently, he does not undo these major egalitarian reforms. So he ends up reconfirming the abolition of states, the state system, the traditional three states into which French society was organized. For example, the clergy, the nobility, and the third estate. He does not restore them. Privileges and local liberties that the aristocracy and the clergy enjoyed in traditional France, that were revoked by the revolution, Napoleon does not do anything about it. He does not he does not revoke the revocations made by the revolution. So those privileges and local liberties that the first two orders, the first two states enjoyed, and they had been done away with by the revolution, Bonaparte stands by it. He also stood for meritocracy and opening of careers to talent. And in our earlier lecture, we have discussed about this, that had it been the earlier system of high military positions being open for sale, or the practice of sale of offices, as was the practice in the ancient regime, Napoleon himself could have never risen to this position, this high position in French army. And therefore, he has this special love for merit and allowing people from diverse ideological and social background and economic background, provided they had merit, to serve the government, to serve the officialdom that he had created. The vast network of bureaucracy that he had created was manned by meritorious people. And he did not allow this to become an exclusive preserve of some blue blood or some aristocracy or some lineages and families. He rather left it open to people having talent, as he himself was indebted to these changes for his own rise to the position that he did. Similarly, the decentralizing beginnings of the revolution, and we have spoken about it earlier, that France or the French Revolution around 1789, when it had just begun, the original idea was to have some kind of a decentralized, some kind of a federated structure for future. Right in the first couple of years of the revolution, we see some kind of a U-turn when the second phase begins in the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror, the Jacobin period, and so forth, the war times. So these decentralizing sensibilities with which the revolution had begun had already been reversed, but Napoleon all the more reverses it and makes France obviously more centralized by appointing prefects and sub-prefects, and they were all chosen and sent from Paris, in effect, by Napoleon himself. The earlier practice was to have local bodies elect their own leaders, and the center would just abide by their decisions. But that was not to happen. He would rather pick up prefects and sub-prefects from Paris, send them as central representatives to look into the matters of local governance as well. So that provincial autonomy, etc., were never heeded to. Napoleon, in terms of the reforms that he initiated and what even today stands as his contribution in Europe, is primarily coming from the sector of education and law. Napoleon completed the legal and educational reforms initiated by the revolution. He did not go back on it. Rather, he qualitatively enriched it by introducing several measures and by creating several institutions. For example, lycées, which is the French name for high schools, were opened in every major towns of France, and similarly a school in Paris was also created, was instituted for teachers training. So he is very particular about the curriculum, about the content that that needed to be taught to the French citizens. Please remember, the the earlier practice, the ancient practice of the Pope and the papacy and the church being involved in educating the young, etc., were a story of the past. Napoleon does reach out to the church and strikes peace with them, but this particular segment, which earlier was very much dominated by church and its people, that was kept intact for the state only. It was not given back to the church, and therefore education is important for him, and he makes sure that every major town has high schools, and the teachers who are teaching there are centrally trained in Paris, so that there is fair bit of uniformity in what goes as educational curriculum. These are all soft ways by which the idea of nationalism itself was strengthened, and the idea of nationalism itself was articulated, right? Similarly, there were military and technical schools that were brought under state control. You had disparate ways and means by which military and technical training were carried out in the ancient period. Some umbrella kind of an organized way in which things are to be carried out, that was done by Napoleon, and it was all brought under state control. Again, as I would say, that it is again a kind of assertion of the state in the new order. Similarly, a national university to supervise the entire educational system was also put into place. Now, all these measures obviously have pertinence not only for France, but even beyond, as we will see when he embarks on the project of creating a French empire. 1804, we have the new legal code, popularly known as Napoleonic Code, promulgated, and Napoleon is known for this. It's his flagship program, you can say. And again, this new legal code is something that permeated in areas outside France, also in Europe, as a consequence of those areas being brought under Napoleonic Empire. And this new legal code, which bore the personal stamp of Napoleon, was premised on uniformity. And when I say uniformity, please think of doing away with diverse and disparate customs and privileges that were enjoyed by people and sections of people in different areas. So they were done away with. They had already been done away with, but Napoleon made sure that it was all given some kind of a uniform look, so to say. And then you have individualism, which is yet another pivot of his new legal code, which in effect means private individuals' right to property, contract, leases, trade unions, abolition of trade unions, and so forth. So the bourgeois politics. Reconciliation, as I told you, reaching out to the church as well as the political past political affiliations, not of any consequence in choosing his staff in bureaucracy. You can see on your slide, his joint executives had a terror leader, a bureaucrat of the old regime, an extreme radical Republican was his Minister of Police, Charles Talleyrand, an aristocrat, was his Minister of Foreign Affairs. All this just in the name of careers being open, thrown to talent and only talent. 1801 is he concorded with the Pope, which he reunited church and the state, and the obvious purpose was domestic harmony and international solidarity. And the Pope could now depose French bishops and discipline the French clergy. In return, the Vatican lay to rest any claims against expropriation of former church land. Now, this particular issue was lying litigated for a long time, ever since it was undertaken during the first phase of the French Revolution. and the middle class was the bourgeoisie was getting fed up with it. They wanted some kind of a resolution. So the church gave up all those claims, and bourgeoisie was happy that whatever land that they had bought of the expropriated church land, that is finally settled. And in return, the clergy was guaranteed an income from the state. Religious freedom that was secured by the revolution was kept intact. Clergy was not able to make inroads into that. So, this is about by and large some of the detailings you can see on your slide related to reconciliation and reaching out to the Pope, how appeasement to Jacobins as well as the old order, the conservatives was being made, and that's when we find Napoleon emerging as a pragmatist. So, this is how overall, by resorting to several ceremonies and the way he crowned himself as emperor in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, he is giving some fodder to the conservatives as well. At the same time, he is appearing as a fierce progressivist as well. So that's about the Napoleonic reforms in part 1 of our discussion, and we shall talk more about it in the second part of this. Thank you.